Over the years, I became more and more self-conscious with my ever-drooping face. With each year that passed by, I noticed my cheeks began to sag more and more. It was my sister that finally convinced me to undergo the knife. My sister was almost unrecognizable after all her plastic surgery. Whenever I asked her what work she had done, I zoned out by the time she reached the end of her list. Despite other people's judgments, my sister was happy and confident with herself. So, I took a page from her book and scheduled an eyebrow lift. I found my doctor online. Dr. Gingham had glowing Yelp reviews. On the day of my consultation, Dr. Gingham looked at me with his gentle eyes and asked what brought me in. He told me I reminded him of his late daughter, Patricia, and how he couldn't imagine I would want any work done. I joked with him that praising me wouldn't be a good way to secure a new client. He gave me a warm smile and continued about how I reminded him of his daughter. He explained he lost Patricia 3 years ago when a drunk driver T-boned her going through a light. Dr. Gingham said his daughter was barely recognizable when he identified the body. She was so mangled he had to check for a tattoo she had on her ribs. He seemed like a caring, compassionate man with extensive experience in plastic surgery, so I trusted him with my face. The day of the appointment came, and I almost got cold feet and canceled the whole thing. I wish I did. I was uneasy in the office, but my sister assured me it would be fine. "It's just an eyebrow lift," she told me. "I doubt you'll even see a difference when the doctor is done." I changed from my clothes to a hospital dress and waited for the nurses and doctor to begin. They took my vitals and asked me a bunch of questions, and then Dr. Gingham came in and marked my face where the cut would be. He started by marking my chin, and I stopped him. "Why would you make an incision by my chin if we're just doing an eyebrow lift?" Dr. Gingham laughed. "I was just testing you." He winked at me, but my uneasiness didn't fade. I forced a chuckle to make it seem like it was okay. He took his pen up to my eyes and made a few marks. "Okay, are you ready?" he asked me. I nodded. One of his nurses came up and instructed me to count back from 10. I started. 10, 9, 8, 7, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a bed much more comfortable than the one I fell asleep on. I looked around, but it didn't look or smell like a hospital. It smelled like freshly baked cookies and looked like a teenager's bedroom. My face felt tight, and I tried to lift my hands to touch my face, but I was restrained to the bed. I tried to yell for help, but the bandages muffled any noise I strained to make. Suddenly, an older woman peered around the corner of the open door. We made eye contact, and I tried to ask for help. She checked her surroundings before creeping into the room. "Patricia?" she said. I shook my head. "My sweet Patricia," she smiled. I guess she didn't see me shake my head no. "Honey!" Dr. Gingham rushed into the room and escorted the old woman out. On their way to the door, I heard him say, "She's not ready for you, my darling." It was a while before Dr. Gingham came back. He sat on the edge of my bed, which made me uncomfortable. I tried to push him off, but he didn't budge. He looked at me with those kind eyes, but I wondered if they were a true reflection of him. "I was so happy when you came into my office. You just looked so much like her. Just a few tweaks needed to happen before you could really be her." Dr. Gingham caressed my face. I flinched away. "Sorry about her. She's just excited to have her daughter back." This is when I started to panic. I was tied to a bed with bandages covering my face to the point that I couldn't speak. I started pulling at the restraints. "Now, honey," Dr. Gingham embraced me. I yelled as loud as I could, but the bandages muffled everything. "You're confused," Dr. Gingham smiled at me. "Sorry, this must all be very confusing. After all, you fall asleep in one room and wake up in another. Let me explain. My wife, who you just met, has dementia. It got worse after our daughter died. With losing my daughter and essentially losing my wife all in one go, I have fantasized that someone would walk into my office and just need a few adjustments to replace my daughter. I thought maybe not only could I get Patricia back, but maybe it would also help my wife's condition. My heart pounded against my chest. When I saw you, I knew you were the one. You only needed a nose job, some work on your chin, and an eyebrow lift to become Patricia's twin. We did the chin work, so I still need to do 2 more operations before you're complete. You can assimilate into my family once all the surgeries are done. Since I couldn't speak, I couldn't even ask him what his plan was if I didn't agree to assimilate into his family. We're going to do the surgeries over the next couple of days, so for now, rest. He took a syringe and injected something into my arm that made me feel very drowsy. The room went black again. I woke up again, and Dr. Gingham was in the room with another lady. I tried to make eye contact with her, praying she would see the desperation in my eyes and help. Except the nurse never looked at me. Dr. Gingham turned to me. Only 1 more to go. Do you want to watch some movies while you rest up for the second one? No, I wanted to tell him. I want to go home. He smiled at me 1 more time before he left. I had to come up with a plan to get out of here. I couldn't see a way to avoid the 3rd surgery, so I decided I had to wait. After the surgery, I would pretend to sleep longer so they wouldn't keep giving me whatever medicine made me drowsy. I would regain my strength, escape restraints, and run like hell. Dr. Gingham finally made an appearance after a couple of days passed. In the meantime, I tried to figure out how to get out of the restraints. Ready for your final surgery? Dr. Gingham said excitedly. I shook my head and he laughed as if I was telling a joke. You have the same sense of humor as Patricia. I'm so happy you walked into my office. He gave me an earnest smile before injecting the drowsy liquid into my arm. When I woke up this time, I kept my eyes closed. I could hear them buzzing around me, but I remained still. She should have woken up by now, Dr. Gingham said. I heard the steady beep of the heart monitor as he and his nurse left the room. I waited until I felt fully conscious before starting to act. I began to pull my right hand to try and wiggle it out of the cuff. I knew the only way would be to break my hand. Through my nose, I sucked in a big breath and pulled my arm hard. There was a sharp pain in my thumb joint, but I kept pulling until my hand was out. With my good fingers, I started to undo the restraints. When I stood up, the room started to spin. I considered getting back in bed and waiting a little bit longer. But what if they found out I got out of the restraints? I peered around the corner and it looked like I was in a house. I stayed close to the wall as I crept down the hall towards the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs was the front door. Relief washed over me, just seeing the exit. No one was around, so I sprinted towards the door. I opened it and felt the cool air on my face. In nothing but a hospital gown, I ran as fast as I could down the road until I could flag a car down. A woman was in the car. Are you okay? Do you need help? Help, I tried to say through the bandages. Luckily, she could make out what I was saying and drove me to the nearest hospital. She waited with me and called the cops. When the cops finally came, they took the bandages off, and I was finally able to speak. I explained everything to them and finally got in contact with my family. After some investigating, they couldn't press charges because Dr. Gingham had no record of me coming into his office. I asked them to check the security footage, and according to Gingham's office, the security footage from that day glitched, and they didn't have any. The cops admitted it was suspicious, but they couldn't charge him for anything since they had no hard evidence. When I finally looked in the mirror at my new face, part of me wished I could have kept the bandages on forever. What looked back at me wasn't my face, but a stranger I had to live with forever. Every day was a new lesson at McDonald's. I'm 19, working at a fast food joint to make some extra cash for my upcoming trip to Cyprus. Serving burgers and fries to all sorts of people, some nice, others not so much, had become my daily grind. It was fascinating, though. Interacting with different people made the mundane shifts a bit more bearable. Among our regulars was a homeless man, always standing with his sign, smiling at the passing cars. He'd occasionally come in to swap his change for notes or to buy coffee. We all knew him. He was polite, kind, and always had a good word for everyone. His name was Tom. One chilly evening, Tom came in with his usual jar of change. His eyes lit up as he approached the counter. "A large caramel frappe, please. Lots of cream, lots of sauce," he said, his voice cheerful despite the cold. I punched in his order but accidentally made it a medium. I quickly told the girl on Bev's cell to add extra cream and sauce, making it look like a large. When I handed it to him, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. He giggled, thanked us multiple times, and walked out to a nearby bench, savoring every sip of his drink. That $3 frappe had made his day. Watching him, I realized how much we take for granted. Here was a man whose entire week was brightened by a simple drink. My own upbringing wasn't exactly privileged, raised by a single mom since I was 9, but we got by. I had a job, free food on my breaks, and a decent paycheck. Yet I had never felt such gratitude for these little things. The next day, something was off. Tom didn't show up at his usual spot. Days passed, and he was still nowhere to be seen. Concern gnawed at me. One evening, I decided to check the alleyway where he usually slept. What I found made my blood run cold. Tom was lying there, beaten and unconscious. Beside him was a note scribbled in a shaky hand. "I just wanted to make people smile." I called 911 and the paramedics arrived quickly. They said he'd been attacked but would recover. The police launched an investigation, but the assailant was never found. It haunted me. Who could do such a thing to someone as kind as Tom? Weeks passed, and Tom slowly recovered. I visited him in the hospital, bringing him his favorite caramel frappe. He smiled weakly, grateful as ever. "I didn't know people could be so cruel," he said, his voice trembling. "But I also didn't know people like you existed. Thank you." Tom's words stuck with me. How could the world be so heartless, yet so capable of kindness? I wanted to do more to help him. So I started a fundraiser at work. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Customers, colleagues, even strangers pitched in. Within weeks, we raised enough to get Tom a small apartment and a job at a local shelter. The twist came when I discovered who had attacked him. It was a group of local teens, bored and looking for trouble. One of them, Mike, was a regular at our McDonald's. I confronted him, my heart pounding. "Why did you do it?" I asked, anger and sadness mixing in my voice. Mike looked ashamed, avoiding my gaze. "We didn't think... I didn't think," he stammered. We were just messing around." "Messing around?" I echoed, disbelief in my voice. "You almost killed him." Mike apologized, and I saw genuine regret in his eyes. He agreed to volunteer at the shelter where Tom now worked, seeking redemption. Tom's recovery and the community's support restored my faith in humanity. We had our flaws, our dark sides, but kindness could prevail. It wasn't just about the big gestures. Sometimes, it was just a simple caramel frappe that made all the difference. As I prepared for my trip to Cyprus, I felt a new sense of purpose. Life had its cruelties, but also its moments of profound beauty. And in those moments, we found our humanity. Be kind, I reminded myself. Be kind.
I met Tommy first. He was the most charming of the group. In his 20s, just like myself, but with a perspective on life that was way beyond his years. I was drawn to him by his charisma, but I felt nothing romantic for him. He was just a figure that I liked, so I drew closer to him. He told me about his music band. It's a group of 4, so we're more than a crowd as it stands, but we can do with one more backing vocal, and I think you have the talent for it, he had said. I had said yes to him, not realizing that from that point on, my life would change so much that every part of my being would be entwined with the band. We did everything together, And soon, I fell in love with Mike. Mike was the drummer, and he was very good at what he did, just as everyone else. And soon we started a successful touring business, playing gigs across the country to keep the band operational. We had played for 7 months before we got the deal to record another album for the company. The sum was the biggest the band had ever seen, Mike confided in me, and for some reason, he mentioned that things got better in his life since I came on board. "You're my good luck charm," he would whisper to me, and it would make me feel so good. "I can't lose you." If the rest of the band, Tom, Alex, and Jenny, felt that way, I had no way of knowing because they never told me about their finances or operations before I was brought on. There was no envy in the group because Alex and Jenny had a thing, and Tommy, the lead vocalist, would rather continue with his pursuit of different women every night than turn his eyes on either Jenny and I. So it made sense that I loved Mike just as Jenny loved Alex, leaving Tommy to his exploration. It did not matter much to us as long as we toured, until we stopped touring to record the project. Tommy called it the album of his life, and all of the perks that he desired were made possible by the company. He asked for the regular cabin home in the countryside, far away from the distractions of the inner cities, to be arranged. Food and drinks would come every weekend through the same delivery person. We had television for entertainment, but to retain the purity of the process, no one would have internet or cell network except him. Seemed reasonable. And for the first week, creativity and collaboration results proved Tommy's words true. It was the best time of our recording. But Mike felt different, and he told me about it. Mike confided in me about his concern for Tommy during our private conversation. His eyes underscored this worry. Tommy had always been the affable and charismatic leader of the band. "What if things go wrong and we need to leave?" Mike asked. Was it not manipulation that made us ride on Tommy's words against our own interests to settle in a secluded area of the world just to put out a record? Mike would say, and usually end his rants with the cryptic statement that he could not lose me. I did not think much of what was said the first time, even though it caused me some worry. But Mike's fears were relentless, and as the days passed, so did his concerns, which he mentioned to me. The energy started to go awry by the end of the second week, and I could feel Mike slipping into a dark web that threatened to consume him if he did not snap out of it. In my worry and resolution to not talk to anybody about it, I had the recording company provide us with shrooms like those we took when we were on tour. It had been my desire that some time away from the group, alone at the waterfront, would heal his fears. We took the shrooms alone, as the rest of the group did not do them with us, and we headed to the lake, which was closest by 1.5 miles away from the cabin. I had no idea how badly Mike had allowed the seclusion to affect him, but when we arrived at the beach, he seemed like a different version of himself. At first, he started drooling, with spit running down his lips as we sat quietly by the water, watching the dark clouds gather overhead. I asked Mike if he was okay. "I love you, Olivia. I don't want to lose you too," he said to me. Even though it made me worry, I tried to comfort him by placing my right hand on his warm left hand. "You won't lose me, Mike. I'll be here with you forever," I said, but Mike shook his head. I suspected it was a bad trip from the shrooms. "You don't understand!" His voice thundered into a yell, and he leapt to his feet. "I've been trying to tell you since we moved into that damn cabin!" I hesitated to speak, my mouth hanging open. The moment felt surreal, like a blend of dream and reality as I stumbled, struggling to distinguish between the two. Mike moved over and held my hands, his eyes teary and his lips quivering. I started to panic. The fact that the shrooms had hit me so terribly made the moment even more terrifying because Mike did not look much like himself anymore, but a shifting figure that was almost an otherworldly macabre in feature. I begged him to stop the torture, and instead he laughed, You're not the first backup vocalist we have had. Tommy likes to take his time with them, build trust, break them down bit by bit until he does it, Mike said, cackling. The son of a devil enchants them, worships them like a goddess in a ritual, takes them from behind and eventually fires them from the band. All the women I have loved. What are you talking about? I bawled, scared beyond my wit. The company always cleans the mess. But I can't let him do it to you. You are not to be the product of his ritualistic fetish. Mike continued. You're within cell range. Call the cops and I'll tell them you left. His crying did not stop until I did. I told the cops where the cabin was, and it was only then that Mike eased. When we returned, Tommy had been arrested, and I had my heart in my mouth as I got to know all about the past cases and the women who chose to speak. It struck me that if Mike had not confessed me on that bad shroom trip at the lake, I would have ended up like them. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever experienced in my life. My windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the rain beating down on my car. I was driving through winding mountain roads on my way home from a business trip. I promised my wife I would make it home tonight, but the rain was coming down so hard it made the road almost impossible to see. I had been driving all day, and I could feel myself beginning to doze off. I rolled down my window a little so the cold air would jolt me awake, but soon after I was nodding off again. The roads curved around steep cliffs and tall trees. I decided to stop because it would be too easy to drive off the road and end up wrapped around a tree, or worse. I looked for signs for upcoming towns. I hoped to come across a McDonald's or something so I could grab something to eat and get a coffee. If I had 30 minutes to an hour to regroup and re-energize, I'd make it home to see my wife and daughter. Suddenly, a road sign listing upcoming rest stops zoomed by me. It only listed one gas station, a Motel 6, and a diner. I decided to stop at the diner. I drove for a few more miles until I entered a small area with 3 streetlights. On one side of the road, there was the motel, and on the other, there was a gas station and a diner. I parked at the diner and went in. The diner was next to dead. Beside me, an old man was sitting at the bar eating a slice of apple pie and talking to the cooks, and a group of teenagers loudly laughed in one of the booths. I made eye contact with one of the waitresses. She was older than me, and her skin drooped with age. Her cheeks were stained a bright pink with blush, and her lips were a bold red. It looked like she tried to put on fake eyelashes, but put the glue in the wrong place. My wife always complained about false lashes and how hard they were to wear. The waitress gave me a big smile, revealing a little lipstick on her front teeth. She opened her mouth to speak. "Sit anywhere you'd like, hun." In response, I smiled and nodded. I sat in a booth as far away from the pack of teenagers as possible. Within a minute, the same waitress was at my table. "Hey there, handsome." She smiled, her lipstick-stained teeth wiped clean. "What can I get you to drink?" "I would love some coffee," I told her. "What's a good-looking man like you doing way out here all by yourself?" "Well, driving home from a work trip. Promised the missus I'd be home tonight." "What's a good-looking woman like you doing way out here?" My wife and I agreed we could flirt with other people if it were just for fun. Darla's pink cheeks took on a red undertone. "Oh, stop." She smiled at me and lightly slapped my shoulder with the back of her hand. "You're lucky it's only raining, not snowing. You'd have to stop for the night if it was snowing." "Well, the rain's no joke either. I could barely see through my windshield getting here." That, in combination with driving all day, I needed a break. "Do you want anything else, or just that coffee?" I told her I needed a moment to look over the menu. She winked at me as she left. She brought me a cup of water and a mug of coffee. As she placed the cups on the table, her eyes widened and she tried to make eye contact with me. Her attempt at intense eye contact made me uneasy, so I avoided it, but she ducked her head to meet my eyes. "Any idea what you want to eat?" "Yeah. Can I please have the cheeseburger?" I ordered. She scribbled on her pad. "Fries okay with that?" I nodded. She winked at me again as she left. As I waited, I texted my wife to give her an update. Darla was giggling with another waitress, and they kept looking over at me. I gave them an uneasy smile. I regretted flirting with her that little bit. One of the cooks yelled out, "Orders up for Darla's next baby daddy!" I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. The waitresses giggled. "Oh, leave me alone," Darla told the cook playfully. She brought me my burger. She stroked my arm and said, "Enjoy," with what I think was supposed to be a seductive look. I nodded and barely smiled back in response. While I ate my burger, I called my wife. I figured that would cool Darla off if she saw me talking to my wife. My wife and I chatted while I ate my burger. She told me how bedtime went with my daughter and how much they missed me. I assured her I would be home as soon as possible after I finished my burger. I felt more awake and ready for the last few hours of driving, even in the heavy rain. Darla brought out a milkshake. "On the house," she said as she put it in front of me. I'd lie if I said I was put off. I was excited for the free milkshake and slurped it down. Honestly, despite what happened next, it was objectively a delicious milkshake. Darla cleared my plates and left me the check. Every time she came to my table, she kept stroking my arm. When she dropped the bill off, I tried to dodge her touch, and her demeanor changed. She went from sickly sweet to angry with me. As I wrote the tip amount and signed my name, my head felt heavy. The room started spinning. I looked at the waitresses. They weren't paying me any mind, except Darla, glancing over at me every so many seconds. I tried to stand up to leave, but collapsed, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in a motel bed. My hands were handcuffed to the bedpost. I looked around. Sun shined through the curtains. Someone had folded my clothes and placed them on the desk across from the bed, and someone was moving around in the bathroom. "Hello?" I called out. Darla's head popped out of the bathroom. "Oh, you're finally awake." She walked out with smeared makeup. I tried to pull at my restraints, but I couldn't get out of them. They were looped around the bedpost in a way that I couldn't just stand up and run. What happened?" My heart beat against my chest as I looked around. It looked bad, and I had no idea what happened. "What time is it?" "It's about 10:30. She smiled and sat beside me, placing her hand on my chest. I tried to shake her off, but her hand remained. "Don't worry, I told your wife. You know, you gave all of us in that diner quite the scare when you collapsed. The cooks helped me take you across the street to the motel to sleep. I guess you were more tired than you thought." "Why am I like this?" She smiled deviously. "Why do you think?" She winked. "I need to call my wife." She reminded me she already talked to her. Panic rose in my chest, and it became hard to breathe. I kept wondering why I was only in my boxers over and over in my head. Darla stood up to retrieve my phone from the desk. She sat beside me, curled up against my restrained arms. She looped one hand around my neck and started playing with my hair. Darla showed me the messages she sent to my wife. She sent spicy photos of her and me together, and multiple videos of her on top of me. She didn't include my face in all the pictures and videos, so you wouldn't know I was passed out. I wanted to vomit. "Get away from me!" I yelled, and I violently shook my body to get her away from me. "Uncuff me, now!" I demanded. Darla looked confused, but then her expression relaxed. "Don't worry. When you meet Jack, you'll feel better." "Who the hell is Jack?" Darla was offended. My son? I told you all about him last night. Trust me, when you meet him, you'll know you made the right choice. What choice? I spit at her. I passed out and woke up like this in a motel room, trapped with your decaying ass. Now she was really offended. She slapped me. I became increasingly agitated, demanding that she uncuff me. She seemed appalled at the idea, and her eyes illuminated with an idea. I know what will make you feel better. She crawled on top of me, straddling me. No! I yelled. Get off! I twisted and turned my body so she couldn't sit comfortably. Once she was off, I kicked her in the stomach and she stumbled backward. She fell and hit her head on the corner of the desk. Darla! I called out. No response. Relief flooded my system. I told myself it would be okay because I would be able to say I killed her in self-defense. My mind immediately went to my wife. She saw those horrible images. There was no guarantee she would believe me about what happened, and I prayed she would. I waited for hours for the cleaners to enter the room. They were startled to see a man handcuffed to the bed and a dead woman on the floor. Thankfully, one of them grabbed a towel to cover me. The police took a while since we were in the middle of nowhere. They uncuffed me and they took my statement. They believed me since I was trapped, and I had proof of Darla's actions in my messages to my wife. When I called my wife, I could tell she had been crying. She weakly asked me what happened. I told her, and I begged her to believe me and work through this with me. She understood, and was more concerned about me and what I just endured. She told me she knew I would never cheat on her with an old hag like Darla. After we talked, I knew I would be okay, and Darla got what she deserved. However, I think of her son from time to time and wonder what happened to him. Hopefully, he found a more stable caretaker. Growing up, I used to be really close to my sister Holly. We did everything together. She was 1 year older than me, and we looked a lot alike, so strangers always assumed that we were twins. Eventually, Holly moved away to college while I stayed in our hometown. We still talked regularly on the phone, but I could feel Holly slowly start to pull away from me. Our daily phone calls got shorter and more sporadic until eventually we weren't talking at all. I didn't even know that Holly had dropped out of college until one of our mutual friends told me. I guess Holly had started dating a new guy named Alan who was a pretty bad influence on her. I'd never met him in person, but he was the kind of possessive boyfriend who wanted to control everything in his girlfriend's life, including who she talked to. Alan was also pretty religious, so he pressured her to quit school, marry him, and devote her life as a homemaker. They didn't have any kids yet, but it was only a matter of time. After nearly 2 years of radio silence, I was starting to get desperate. I missed Holly a lot, but more than that, I was worried about her life choices. She was such a smart and talented person. She deserved better than to give everything up for a guy. Holly unfriended me on all her socials, and the only way I could keep tabs on her was by checking Alan's Facebook, which, thankfully, wasn't set to private. He posted regularly, and he always shared photos of the two of them hanging out with their new church friends. I'm the kind of person who tries to keep an open mind, but those photos really creeped me out. Everyone in Holly's life was either a blank-eyed housewife like her, or a controlling husband like Alan. It just seemed so unhealthy. This June, I found a very interesting post on Alan's page. It was an announcement about their upcoming Independence Day party. They were planning something big at their house for all their friends. Dozens of people left comments saying that they were going to attend. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for me to finally talk to Holly directly. I knew it was a risky plan, If I showed up uninvited, I knew that my sister's husband would immediately throw me out. But at the very least, I'd still get to see Holly. Even if she told me directly that she never wanted to see me again, at least I'd have closure. So I wrote down the time and location of the party. That was definitely a good decision because the very next day, Alan had deleted the post completely. A few weeks later, the 4th of July rolled around and I was ready. I bought bags of Swedish fish and candy corn, Holly's 2 favorite snacks. Their party started at noon, so I arrived a half hour later after most of their guests had already arrived. As I walked into the busy front yard, everything decorated with red, white, and blue, I saw at least a dozen couples just like Alan and Holly. The wives all had vacant expressions, while the husbands drank and joked around. Weird chanting music was playing from the speakers. A few people saw me walk in, but they all looked away, as if they could sense that I wasn't one of them. That didn't stop me, though. I continued through the yard until I reached Holly, who was at a table refilling bowls of chips. "Hey," I said. She spun around. I expected her to be shocked to see me, but I didn't expect her to look absolutely horrified. "What are you doing here?" "Can we talk?" I asked. I figured if we sat down somewhere quiet, we could hash things out. But before Holly could answer, Alan walked over and wrapped his arm around her shoulder in a very territorial way. Then he looked me right in the eyes and said, "We think you should leave." I anticipated that kind of reaction from him, and I was ready to stand my ground. "She's my sister. If she wants me to leave, then I want to hear it from her." Alan squeezed Holly closer to him. She looked scared. "Well, Holly, do you want me to leave?" I pressed. "The party is for our church," she explained. "You wouldn't want to be a part of it." "Why not?" I asked. "Because everyone here has found their soulmates," Alan explained. "This party is meant for couples, so there's no space for you." Again, I told him that I wanted my sister to answer for herself. "It's a very important day for us," Holly finally said. "You wouldn't understand what we're about to do." I felt chills run down my spine. What we're about to do? What did that even mean? I got the horrible feeling that their group wasn't really a church at all. It sounded like a cult. It sounded like they were planning to drink poison Kool-Aid or something. Aside from all the American flags and patriotic decorations, there were a few church banners hanging from the porch. All of them had cryptic slogans like, "We see through him," and "He is watching," stuff like that. "You're not going to hurt yourselves?" I asked. Again, Alan started to answer, but this time, Holly stopped him. "We're here to solidify our bonds, that's all." Then, after a long breath, she added, "Please leave." I had my answer. I wasn't welcome here, and I never would be. There was nothing I could say to make Holly change her mind. So I said goodbye and left. But I didn't go home. Instead, I got in my car and drove to the next street. Then I parked and hid in the neighbor's yard behind some bushes. I wanted to see for myself what weird ritual they had planned. And if things looked dangerous, I'd call the police. I crouched there for a long time, watching as the couples ate their burgers in mostly silence. The men all seemed excited, but the women were still blank-faced. None of them ate until their husbands told them they could. It seemed deeply sexist, but nothing illegal was going on. And then the music stopped, and everyone gathered in the center of the yard. Alan seemed to be the leader. He stood on a water cooler, so he was taller than everyone else, and he made a speech. "The world is a horrid, hate-filled place. It's too much for the women in our lives to witness. If everyone's ready, it's time to begin." Immediately, the couples formed a line in front of Alan. The men were all holding scarves. Something terrible was about to happen. Alan looked down at the first couple, a short, bald man and his much more attractive wife. He spoke to the husband first. "Do you vow to guide your soulmate on the right path?" The man nodded. Then Alan turned toward the wife. "And do you vow to always follow your soulmate's directions, to accept the world as he describes it to you?" The wife nodded. Then Alan pulled out a bottle of Gorilla Superglue. The wife stepped closer and waited. He poured 3 drops each in both of her eyes. She didn't react to the pain. With her eyes now shut closed forever, she whispered, "Thank you." Then she stepped to the side, and her husband held her hands with a smile. "Next!" Alan shouted. The next couple stepped forward. I couldn't believe this was really happening. I'd heard of some awful religious rituals throughout the world, but I never imagined that women would choose to be blinded like that. I felt sick to my stomach. While Alan gave the same speech to the next couple, I pulled out my phone and called 911. "Don't do that." I looked up and I saw Holly standing behind me. She's found me. "He's going to blind you," I said. "I have to stop him." "It's what we want," she said. "If you stop us, we'll never ascend into perfect soulmates." I looked into her eyes. They were light blue, just like mine. Even though there was sadness and fear in her eyes, there was determination, too. I couldn't talk her out of it. So, I did the only thing I could do. I punched her right in the face. Before she could recover, I grabbed her and pulled her toward the street. She was struggling with me, but I got her in my car and I drove her straight to the police station. I took her inside, where I explained everything to the policemen. They sent some officers to the house, where they found 12 blinded women and their husbands. Alan had gotten to every woman at that party, except Holly. Unfortunately, Alan had left before the police could catch him. Holly stayed at my house after that. Over time, I felt like I'd finally talked some sense into her. She seemed to finally accept that she had been brainwashed by her husband. Everything seemed to be going well. Until this morning. I woke up to find Holly had left in the middle of the night. I don't know where she is, but I know deep down that she went back to Alan. I'm terrified of what's going to happen to her. My sister Jennifer and I went to Lake Havasu for spring break this year. I was in my last year of college, and I really needed a break. Jennifer planned everything out. She rented a Lexus so we wouldn't have to drive our own cars through the desert, and she picked out a hotel right on the lake. Our first day there was pretty great. We spent most of the time hanging out by the pool, which was a lot warmer than the cold lake water. Jennifer got a little drunk, so by the end of the night she was kind of embarrassing herself. I think the concierge noticed because she was glaring at us through the lobby window. Just before dinner time, Jennifer met another tourist, a really handsome ginger guy. She left with him to have dinner in one of the beachside restaurants. I was not invited. I ended up eating room service alone in our room and waiting for Jennifer to come back. She never did. When I woke up the next morning, I assumed that my sister was hooking up with that red-haired guy. Wouldn't be the first time she ditched me during a vacation. Just in case, though, I decided to go downstairs and ask the concierge if she'd seen Jennifer. I remembered how she glared at us the night before, so I was positive that she'd remember my sister. I found the woman standing behind the front desk in the lobby. Her name tag said Maria. I politely introduced myself, but she already knew exactly who I was. "You're the sister of that loud, drunk woman, aren't you?" She wasn't wrong. "Yes," I told her, "but I'm worried that she's gone missing. She met this red-haired guy and..." Maria's eyes widened in horror. She asked if the red-haired man had a snake tattoo on his arm. I nodded. He definitely had a snake tattoo. "Oh my God," she said. "You have to come with me." Before I could ask any questions, Maria abandoned her desk, grabbed my wrist, and raced through the lobby and into the parking lot. It all happened so suddenly, I didn't get a chance to find out what was going on. All I knew was that this woman thought my sister was in trouble. We got into her Jeep, and she sped onto the highway. As she drove, she explained that the man who took my sister was extremely dangerous. For months now, he'd been kidnapping tourists and taking them into the desert, where no one ever saw them again. Maria said that the man had already taken several guests from her hotel, though there was never enough evidence to arrest him. He was barred from the property, but apparently he snuck back in. Thankfully, Maria knew exactly where the man was hiding. If we were lucky, we'd get there before anything happened to Jennifer. I took out my phone to call 911, but Maria told me to stop. She said we could handle things on our own. I didn't like that idea, but everything was happening so fast that I didn't argue with her. She pulled her Jeep up to a rundown trailer in an isolated area off the main road. It didn't look like anyone lived here. Maria got out of the car and walked straight to the trailer's door. She kicked it open and barged inside. "Hey!" she shouted angrily. Honestly, she was acting like Maria Connor from the Terminator movies, all tough and angry. I was glad I had her on my side. I followed her inside the trailer. The ginger man stood frozen in the kitchen area, obviously scared by our sudden arrival. I didn't do anything, he said. He had his hands above his head. "Where is she?" Maria demanded. "In the back," he muttered. "I'll show you." With his hands still raised over his head, he walked through the trailer toward a door. Maria and I followed him. Slowly, he pushed open the door, revealing only darkness on the other side. It looked like a wooden shed that the man had built onto the back of the trailer. I couldn't see Jennifer. "She's in there," the ginger man said. "Look for yourself." I really wanted to see my sister, but I didn't trust this man for a second. "Bring her out!" I demanded. Maria walked around the man and wrapped something tight around his hands. I think she used a handkerchief. "It's okay," she told me. "Just go inside and check. I'll watch him." Thank God Maria was here. I pulled out my phone and turned on flashlight mode. I started to take it with me, but Maria told me to let her hold it with one hand so I could see better. As she held up the light behind me, I walked inside. The room was so dark, but I could see Jennifer lying in the corner. Her hair was in her face. I couldn't tell if she was alive. I ran to her and shook her shoulder, but then the whole room turned black before I could see her face. The door had closed behind me. "Maria!" I screamed. "Let me out of here!" I could hear my sister moaning. She was still alive, but barely conscious. "Sorry," Maria said through the door, "but I can't let you mess things up for my brother." I couldn't believe it. The man was her brother. They were a team. Through the door, she explained that her brother only kidnapped loud, obnoxious tourists that traveled here alone. He thought Jennifer was alone because that was what she'd told him back at the pool. He didn't expect someone like me to come looking for her. "What are you going to do with us?" The man started to laugh horribly. He said they were going to keep us in there until we died. No one would ever find us. "You shouldn't have given me your phone," Maria taunted. I held Jennifer. She was covered in sweat from spending so long in this room. Her arms were trembling. Outside the door, I could hear the siblings talk casually. It sounded like they were congratulating each other, like they were fishermen and we were fish. What they didn't know was that I had a second phone in my back pocket. I always kept it for emergencies. I dialed 911 as soon as they left the trailer. In less than 30 minutes, we were rescued. Jennifer is still recovering in the hospital, but it looks like she's going to be okay.
I stared into his eyes, and I found them honest. But for some reason which I couldn't readily place, I couldn't bring myself to think too much about what Nathan said without feeling as though he was exaggerating the effect of the new atmosphere on me. This place, he mentioned it when he looked around, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He continued in a low voice. It's not what it seems to be. There had been no eeriness in his statement. It had simply been a statement, like one would casually say as a salutation to a neighbor. Nathan was handsome by most definitions of what a good-looking man would be, and he was one of the first people I spoke to when I recently moved into my new home. The suburban estate was quiet, a world away from the bustle of the city where I had spent most of my adult life with my ex-husband. A messy divorce, a noisy city that penetrated my senses, and a stalking, violent ex-husband made this new house a home for me. I mentioned the issue to Nathan once in our conversation, but I was sure that he hadn't enough presence of mind to measure what I really meant by everything. The Lassards, my neighbors, from a few houses down the same row, visited a few weeks after I had settled in. Unlike Nathan, they seemed more cheerful about the place, both bespectacled with such supple facial skin that did not betray their age. I discovered the Lassards to be very fond of humor. When one spoke, the other always seemed to have an accompanying laughter for it. And to avoid an awkward confrontation, I soon found myself laughing at everything that was said by them either. By the end of their second visit to my home, a stop by and a walk, I was told by the couple that they were part of the neighborhood watch. They were part of the families that had moved into the area when it was very sparse, and they said that a lot had changed when they first moved in. It's become a very busy place since we moved here, Ava. People have moved into the neighborhood and some have left, Miss Lassard said to me, and I chuckled when Mr. Lassard did, even though I thought it was weird that she had said it like that. But you're safe here, Ava. Mr. Lassard nodded his head to punctuate what his wife had been saying. If you need anything, you can come to us and we'll help. I found myself at peace in the new neighborhood, regardless of what Nathan or the Lassards had said, and I was determined to keep it that way. Weeks rolled by slowly, and I became better with the quietness in the mornings and the strange stillness of the air at noon. At dusk, I would walk around to take in the atmosphere of my new neighborhood. I did this walk habitually until I noticed something weird under very strange circumstances. Most of the houses in the neighborhood were numbered like I had expected them to be, but under their numberings, I noticed symbols which I couldn't readily identify. For the houses that had those symbols, I never saw anyone come in or out of them. I talked to Nathan about it without stressing how uncomfortable it made me, and he smiled with his eyes dead on me and told me that he said all that he could say. The neighborhood had strange things happened every other time, and the news of it never made it out. I asked what it was that he had seen. Nathan took a long drag of his cigarette and smiled. Perhaps he said it was the neighborhood watch who had put those symbols under the numbers of those houses, which occupants did not comply with their regulations. With that, I was dismissed, but I did not leave without a sense of caution that there was something Nathan was hiding. My nightmares translated to reality quickly when my cat went missing by the end of the same week that I had expressed my fears to Nathan. My first instinct was anger. I had a sense that I was being messed with, so I rushed to Nathan's house, which was just by mine. "Open up, you sick freak!" I yelled at the door in anger that he had taken my cat to play games with me. My anger waned and frustration kicked in when I knocked repeatedly, but there was no response to my call. Exhaustion induced common sense, and I returned to my house to search for the tracker which I had put on my cat. I broke out sweating when I found my cat's location was further down the street, away from Nathan's house. I wondered if it had simply strayed, and I took it upon myself to go look for it. My heart pounded in my chest, and my entire body trembled as I braved the night in search of my cat, guided by the tracker. Dread and apprehension from whatever the black, quiet night held terrified me. I watched over my shoulder every step of the way until I finally arrived at the Lassard shed. The elderly couple's offering of help rang in my head, and I debated within myself briefly if it was appropriate that I walk up to the shed and pick up my cat, or if I should just ask their permission. My sense of urgency got the better of me, and I stumbled into the shed myself. Every assurance that I had mustered when I walked into the open fell off me like layers of an onion bulb, and a cold sweat tingled from my spine when the unmistakable smell of blood hit my nostrils. I ran my hand over my mouth to stifle my cry of shock as my eyes roamed over disturbing materials lying around the floor with no care. I was sure my beating heart could be heard all around the neighborhood because it was almost deafening my ears. My limbs shook as I scoured over bloodied surgical tools which laid on the table, supported by a bucket that seemed to contain something macabre. On the wall, I saw a blueprint of the neighborhood with the same symbols I had seen earlier. The markings under them were non-compliant. I didn't have the stomach to look at it, as the idea of such mindless violence of what happened to them is terrorizing me. My legs took cue, and just as I turned to leave, the door shut behind me. We knew you would come. You have been non-compliant, Mrs. Lazard said with a wry smile on her face. Mr. Lazard appeared out of the shadows at this time. He didn't laugh at what was being said. Please, I pleaded, tears running loose from my eyes. They'll never find your body, Mr. Lazard assured me. There was nowhere to run, and the evil couple was blocking my means of escape. And in my mind, I prayed for a quick death, even though I suspected their sick minds would not allow them to pass up the chance to torture me. I fell to my knees in defeat when all of a sudden, the door banged open, and Nathan was there with a gun in hand. Nobody move! The cops are on their way. I didn't call an ambulance for the dead bodies, he said. Oh, thank you, Nathan. This lady burgled her way into our garden and tried to steal from us. Mrs. Lazard lied, feigning hurt as she approached Nathan. Nathan had the good sense to turn the gun on her with a menacing look on his face that he would not hesitate to shoot. I know what you are, and I'll testify to your crimes. Ava, come over here, he said to me, and I never ran so fast towards a person as I ran to Nathan. The police arrived in no time to arrest the Lazards, and the evidence of all the murders they had committed in the neighborhood came to light when their house was searched. I asked Nathan how he knew to come save me. He said that he followed me after I knocked on his door and knew what the Lazards were capable of, but all he needed was proof of it. I hadn't seen my friend Becky in a while. We used to be roommates, but I moved out after she started snipping at me all the time. I didn't know what I did to make her angry, but we kind of lost contact for a bit. Recently, we started to reconnect. After hanging out with her a couple times, all that awkwardness between us was gone. Unfortunately, I really didn't like her new boyfriend, Tyrone. He seemed really sketchy. One night, I invited Becky over to watch our favorite Netflix show. Its latest season had just come out. I won't tell you what the show was because it's pretty embarrassing, but it meant a lot to us. We used to watch it together all the time before we moved out. I was excited when she arrived at my front door with her new friend Sadie. Unfortunately, they brought Tyrone too. He walked in carrying a tray of veggie snacks, but he didn't look like he wanted to be there. His expression was dead serious. Sadie seemed nice, if a bit weird. She was one of those new agey type of people that only talked about wellness and stuff. I guess she and Becky had met in some yoga retreat. There were a few times I got some weird I'm in a cult vibes from her, but I knew I was just jumping to conclusions. Tyrone, on the other hand, I didn't like him at all. He had these really angry, dark eyes, and he kept staring at me from the other side of the room. After the four of us sat for a while, I announced that I needed to go to the kitchen to bring back more snacks. We already had plenty of food on the tables, but I needed an excuse to get away from Tyrone. Unfortunately, he followed me into the other room. Hey, he said, looking over his shoulder to make sure Becky couldn't hear us. I ignored him, so he stepped closer and cornered me against the fridge. I tried to push him away, but he grabbed me by the shoulders and got right in my face. Listen, he whispered. I was terrified. My friends were just one room away, and I was too scared to scream. If Tyrone wanted to, he could snap my neck before Becky and Sadie even got off the couch. "Don't hurt me," I whimpered. "I'm not," he said, then realizing that he was acting pretty threatening, so he let go of my shoulders, but he still had me cornered. "You're in danger. You have to believe me." Becky shouted from the other room. "Is there a problem?" "No," Tyrone answered for me. He turned towards me, his dark eyes looking so desperate. I had to hear him out. "Listen, we don't have a lot of time." I looked at Becky's phone and she was texting Sadie. "They're gonna hurt you tonight. I'm not sure what, but they're planning some kind of cruel prank. The only reason I came was to stop them and to warn you. I don't really know you, but I know you don't deserve whatever those girls are planning." I didn't believe him. Ever since I met him, I just felt bad vibes off of him. When we re-entered the living room, Becky took one look at us and knew that something had happened. "Tyrone, what did you tell her?" "I only wanted to..." Becky started pushing him towards the front door as he tried to reason with her. She shoved him out of my house and locked the door behind him. Then she walked back towards me and apologized. "I never should have invited him. He's always messing with my friends." It felt great to see Becky stand up for me like that. The old Becky would have automatically chosen her boyfriend over me, but I guess that she was different now. Becky and I sat on the couch, and Sadie was in the recliner next to me. She filled us in on what we missed on the TV. Everything went back to normal surprisingly quickly. It felt so comfortable to sit with them and make jokes about the show. It didn't take me long to forget about the weirdness with Tyrone. I still didn't understand what kind of game that he was playing, but it didn't seem to matter now. After another episode, the show went to credits. Becky grabbed the remote and hit pause. She stretched and said that she wanted to take a walk outside to stretch her legs. "I'm in," Sadie said, jumping up. I was fine on the couch, but I figured why not join them? It was better than being alone. Sadie and I followed Becky outside. It was a beautiful night. The moon was full. Becky stopped walking. She turned towards Sadie and whispered, "It's time." Then both Sadie and Becky turned towards me. Their eyes looked so blank as Becky pulled out a knife from her overalls. "I don't know what Tyrone told you, but maybe you should have listened," Becky said. I knew they were joking, but their expressions looked serious. "Come on," I said. "That obviously isn't real." I grabbed Becky's knife by the blade and tried to pry it out of her hand. I instantly pulled my hand back. The knife was real, and now I had a gash on my palm. "Why?" I whimpered. "Because I've always hated you." And she jabbed the knife right into my stomach. Sadie jumped up and down, giggling and clapping. My legs gave way, and I fell to the ground in seconds. I'd never felt such intense, searing pain. My stomach throbbed horribly, and I could feel blood oozing down my shirt. Becky stood over me with a triumphant smile. She nudged me with her foot. The knife was poking out of my stomach. She bent down and pulled out the knife and stabbed me again, when someone came out of the shadows and tackled her to the ground. It was Tyrone. He'd come back to protect me. As he knocked Becky to the ground, Sadie jumped on his shoulders and clawed at him. She was a small woman, and he had no problem slamming her into the ground right on top of Becky. With both of them on the ground, Tyrone turned towards me and scooped me in his arms. I don't remember what happened next, but when I woke up a few hours later, I was in a hospital bed with Tyrone by my side. I was going to be okay. The police never found Becky or Sadie. I don't know where they are or if they'll ever come back, but I'm not too worried. I don't live by myself anymore. I've moved in with Tyrone, and I've never been happier.
Are you sure this address is correct? I said, staring at the details of my next pizza delivery. My coworker Alex shrugged, already moving on to preparing the next delivery. It's the one they gave us. It's probably just some teens who decided to order pizza while messing around. It's already been paid for, so just go and deliver it already. I sighed, hauling the insulated bag into my arms. All right then, see you in a bit. The address in question belonged to the abandoned high school that sat on the outskirts of town. I wasn't a local, so I didn't know the full story, but apparently some kind of tragedy had caused the school to close down several years ago, and it had since fallen into serious disrepair. Now, only homeless people and teenagers ever bothered to go out there. I climbed into my car, punched the address into the GPS, and started driving, hoping this wasn't just some stupid prank. It was a busy Friday night, and I still had a lot of deliveries to make. As I got closer to the abandoned school, the streets seemed to get darker and more deserted, until I was in a completely empty neighborhood. I pulled the car up outside the imposing structure of the school, doused in complete shadow, and swallowed back the flutter of anxiety in my chest. Just make the delivery and get the hell out of there. That's all I had to do. I'd been hoping to find the customer waiting outside for me, but the schoolyard was completely empty. Don't tell me they're inside, I muttered to myself, glancing towards the entrance. The door was sitting wide open, like a maw in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I walked up to it. Hello? Pizza delivery? I called into the opening, peering inside. Nobody there. Was this just a prank after all? Dragging me all the way out here just for the hell of it? With a sigh, I was about to turn back when I heard the squeak of footsteps from inside the school. There was someone in there. Did someone order pizza? I called again. Somewhere in a very faint voice, I thought I heard someone say, "This way." Did they want me to go inside? Grumbling under my breath, I stepped over the threshold, feeling debris crack and shift under my heel. They better give me a damn good tip for this. "This way," the voice whispered again, making me shiver. Why did it sound so close, yet so far away at the same time? "I ain't messing around," I called, my voice echoing strangely down the hallway. "I'm gonna leave your pizza here, okay?" "This way," the voice said again, but I ignored it, setting the pizza box on the ground. I had to get back or I'd be scolded by my superior. I turned around, ready to head back to the exit, and froze. The exit was no longer behind me. Instead, the corridor twisted into another one that hadn't been there before. "What the hell?" I muttered, staring in bewilderment at the passage behind me. Had I taken a turn somewhere and not realized? I could have sworn I'd walked in a straight line this whole time. Pushing down that fear in my stomach, I went back the way I'd come, expecting to see the door leading back outside. But it wasn't there. Instead, another long hallway had taken its place, leading into darkness. What the hell was going on? Was I hallucinating? I reached up and rubbed my eyes, but the scene before me didn't change. I was surrounded by endless corridors, a labyrinth of classrooms and lockers and broken notice boards, yellowed flyers fluttering in an invisible draught. I turned back around and tried going towards where I thought I'd left the pizza, but that had disappeared too. What was happening? It was almost like the school was changing around me, distorting into some kind of maze that I couldn't escape. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I shouted, hoping someone might hear and come to my rescue. But I could already tell the school was empty. It had been from the start. But whose voice had I been hearing earlier? "This way." I gave a start. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone standing at the other end of the corridor, a tall, thin figure. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Should I go that way? With no other option, I decided to follow the voice and the mysterious figure that had been lingering on the edge of my periphery. "This way." There it was again, that faint, breathy whisper that almost sounded like a gust of wind. Was it really someone here, or was I just hearing things? The deeper into the school I went, the more run down and dilapidated things grew. Shadows seeped out from the doorways, glass crunched underfoot from broken windows, and a stale, musty smell began to assault my senses. Whenever I reached a crossroads, with passages stretching in all directions, I would hear that faint, ghostly voice whisper to me, and a glimpse of a shadow amongst the darkness, and I would follow it, not knowing if it was leading me out of here or deeper into the school's spiderweb of corridors. Finally, after what felt like hours, the air began to feel lighter, no longer stale and oppressive. Something fluttered down the corridor towards me, riding on a gust of wind. Did that mean the exit was close? I caught the newspaper before it went past, the edges torn and yellowed from age. The headline made my eyes widen. Death of a high school teacher exposes the dirty game of the headmaster, causes school to close indefinitely. Is that what happened here? Is that why the school was shut down? A bad headmaster? How horrible. It was no wonder this place had such a bad air to it. As I lowered the paper and I looked up, I found myself back in a familiar place. The pizza box that I'd left was sitting at my feet, and the exit was directly ahead of me, as if it had been there the whole time. Without pausing to think about it, I ran towards the door, finally stumbling out into the fresh air. I'd finally made it out of there. When I checked the time, only 5 minutes had passed since I'd arrived in the car. Then everything I just experienced, had it been some kind of elaborate dream? A trick on my mind? When I glanced back towards the school, I thought, just for a moment, that there was someone standing in one of the broken, darkened windows. But then I blinked and there was nothing there after all. I never thought a smell could ruin my life, but it did. The moment my fiancé David switched to that damn natural deodorant, everything changed. It all started 4 months ago, a decision he claimed was for the environment, for his health, for some grand cause I couldn't quite wrap my head around. But the stench that followed was anything but natural. From the very first day, it was unbearable. We had been together for 2.5 years, engaged for 6 months, and living together for a year. I loved David dearly, but this new smell tested the limits of my affection. As a forensic pathologist, I'm used to unpleasant odors, but this was different. This was a relentless, overpowering stench that clung to everything, pervading our home, our car, even my clothes. "David, you need to do something about this," I told him one night, the air between us thick with his scent. "It's getting out of hand." He looked at me with defiance. "It's not the deodorant. You're just used to all those chemicals. This is how a real man smells." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but it was no laughing matter. Our once warm and cozy apartment now felt like a prison. I couldn't sleep in the same bed as him anymore. I started avoiding him, retreating to the spare bedroom at night. During the day, I found excuses to stay out of the house. The worst part was the public humiliation. We took a bus trip one weekend, and the stares were unbearable. People wrinkled their noses, whispered to each other, and shot us dirty looks. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, my love for David turning into a sick joke. "David, everyone notices," I pleaded with him after the trip. "It's not just me. Can't you just try something else?" He scoffed, waving off my concerns. "They're all shills for the chemical industry. This is a conspiracy." I was at my wit's end. Our flat became a battleground of denial and frustration. I couldn't bring friends over, couldn't enjoy a meal without gagging. It was as if an invisible wedge had driven us apart, one that neither of us could see but both could smell. One evening, I returned home to an even stronger odor. It wasn't just David's usual smell, it was something worse. The air was thick, almost palpable. My eyes watered as I stepped into the living room. "David, are you here?" I called out, my voice muffled by the stench. No response. Panic gripped me as I moved through the apartment. Finally, I found him in the bathroom, unconscious on the floor, an empty bottle of the natural deodorant by his side. David! I screamed, shaking him. He groaned, slowly coming to. What happened? You passed out! What did you do? I demanded, fear turning my voice into a shrill cry. I don't know, I just felt dizzy, he muttered, looking dazed. I called an ambulance and they rushed him to the hospital. The doctors discovered that the deodorant contained a high level of an unknown toxin. It had built up in his system, causing severe reactions. David spent a week in the hospital. During that time, he finally admitted he had been wrong. The deodorant had been poisoning him, and by extension, us. It took a near-death experience for him to see the truth. When he returned home, we threw away every natural product he had bought. The smell gradually faded, and our apartment began to feel like a home again. We celebrated our wedding a year later, surrounded by friends and family. David had returned to a regular deodorant, and the only smell that day was the sweet scent of flowers and fresh beginnings.
My husband Tim and I always threw a 4th of July barbecue in our neighborhood. It was a tradition we'd done for nearly a decade, and it was always a highlight of our year. Tim was responsible for the food and fireworks, while I was in charge of pretty much everything else. This year's party was going to be the biggest we ever had. We ordered tons of food, and I invited all our neighbors. Mostly everybody RSVP'd yes, including our next-door neighbor, William. He'd moved into the community 2 years ago, but he'd never been over to our house. He was a friendly, very good-looking man, but he usually kept to himself. I was surprised that he'd agree to come. On the morning before the party, Tim came to me while I was decorating and asked about the guest list. I told him all the people who said yes, but when I mentioned William's name, he got a really weird look on his face. Are you sure that's a good idea? He asked. Inviting William? I asked. Of course it is. It would be rude to invite everyone else except him. Fine, he said angrily. Then he left to buy the fireworks. It was clear that he didn't want William to come to our party, but I had no idea why. I didn't think he'd had a single conversation with William, and the only time I'd ever talked to William for longer than a minute was back when I helped him move in 2 full years ago. Tim had no reason to dislike our neighbor. Tim returned about an hour later with tons of sparklers and other small-scale fireworks. I had finished setting up all the tables and decorations, so I asked if he needed help setting up the fireworks. No, he shouted. I can do this myself. I don't want you to hurt yourself. I thought that was a very strange thing to say. By noon, the first guests had arrived. Pretty soon, our backyard was filled with all our friends. Tim seemed to be in surprisingly high spirits, but I worried that his attitude would change once William showed up. I was wrong. When William arrived, Tim ran over and greeted him like they were long-lost brothers. I instantly relaxed, thinking that I'd misinterpreted his feelings completely. The party seemed to go off without a hitch. With country music blaring from our speakers, Tim served up his burgers and hot dogs, and I sat with the guests. I ended up sitting next to William, and I finally got to learn more about him. He was a fireman for the county, divorced and single. He spent his free time racing hot rods. Overall, he seemed like a really interesting person, despite being somewhat introverted. When we were done eating, Tim gathered everyone to the center of the yard and handed out sparklers and little cherry bombs for us to light. You can't have a 4th of July barbecue without some fireworks, but we always went for the smaller, safer ones. The yard was filled with smoke and lights as we each lit up our tiny fireworks. It was a beautiful moment. William seemed especially excited to participate. Once all the sparklers died down, Tim brought out the next set of fireworks. These were a bit stronger, the kind that you lit on the ground and then had to back away from before they exploded. He'd never gotten this kind before, but I trusted him. He wouldn't buy anything that was too powerful. One by one, Tim passed out the new fireworks to everyone at the party. William was the last guest to take one. I was too far away to hear what Tim told him as he handed it over, but I noticed that William's expression turned a little suspicious when he took it. I didn't know why. Once everyone was ready, Tim climbed up onto a bench and explained the rules. Everyone needed to light their fireworks on the ground and then step back at least 3 feet. He seemed to take the safety rules very seriously. Then he started a countdown so that we could all set off our fireworks at the same time. As he was counting down, William walked up to me. "You didn't get one," he said. He was right. Tim and I didn't have fireworks of our own. Then William handed me his. "Take mine. I'm a fireman, remember? I see this stuff all the time." "Sure," I said, and I took the firework box and lighter from his hands. By then, the countdown ended, and I lit mine just like everybody else. What happened next was a total blur. Just as I lit my fuse, Tim jumped off the bench and dove toward me. He grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me back, just as the fireworks exploded. All the other fireworks did exactly what they were supposed to do. They shot streaks of light into the air. It was really beautiful. But my firework didn't work like that. Instead, it exploded like a bomb. It was the loudest noise I'd ever heard. If Tim hadn't pulled me back, I would have died. Smoke was everywhere, and my ears were ringing terribly. I looked down at Tim, who had gotten between me and the explosion. He was lying on the ground, burnt. I couldn't tell how hurt he was, but it seemed pretty bad. He was also unconscious. Thankfully, someone called 911 right away. An ambulance came and lifted Tim onto a stretcher. As they were taking him away, William walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. "I think your husband was trying to kill me," he said. "What?" I shouted. William explained that he'd seen firework-related accidents before. As a fireman, he could tell when explosives had been tampered with, and he knew that Tim had stuffed his firework box with extra gunpowder. Rather than call him out on it, he gave the explosive to me. "Why?" I asked. "Because I thought you were in on it too," he said. "I guess not." Confused and shell-shocked, I got into the ambulance with Tim and rode to the hospital. I ended up sitting in the hospital waiting room for an hour before a doctor told me that Tim had regained consciousness. I went to his room, where his face was covered in bandages. His arms were bandaged up to the wrists. Both of his hands had been torn off in the explosion. He looked up at me when I entered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. Very slowly, he explained that he had suspected me and William of having an affair, all because he saw me leave his house after I'd helped him move in. I never thought that Tim was a jealous person, and he'd never mentioned his suspicions to me before, but I guess the anger had eaten up at him until he hatched his plan to strike back at our neighbor. I calmly told him that William and I were not having an affair, and if he'd actually gotten to know our neighbor, he would have realized that William was a fireman who'd recognize a tampered firework when he saw one. My husband is still in the hospital, going through physical therapy and learning to use his new prosthetic hooks. If I were a stronger person, I'd be helping him recover. But knowing that he'd done this to himself, that he'd actually tried to murder someone, I've decided to file for divorce. I haven't talked to William since the party, but I figured it was best if I just kept my distance.
My boyfriend Jeremy and I were on a cross-country trip from California to Virginia. We've been in a very happy relationship for 3 years, so I assumed it would be a great experience. It wasn't. By the 3rd day, when we were driving through the ugly New Mexico desert, we started snapping at each other. He didn't like the music I wanted to play. I was annoyed at his loud gum chewing. It was all very minor stuff, but because we were trapped in the car without anyone else to talk to, things escalated pretty quickly. We just pulled into a gas station outside Santa Fe when the fight started. He wanted me to go inside while he was filling up our tank so that I could buy snacks. I told him we already had plenty of snacks and I didn't want to waste money. He started screaming at me, and I screamed back. It was pretty awful. Eventually, I gave in and told him I'd buy him whatever he wanted. Then I left him at the car and stormed inside. The gas station was empty. No one was at the counter. I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. I needed to cool off. Then I came out, slowly browsed the snack aisles, and picked up all of Jeremy's favorites. Slowly, I was able to calm down. The cashier came in from the back door. I assumed he was on a smoke break or something. He seemed nice enough and asked me how my day was going. Great, I told him. But I think you could tell from my voice that I was still annoyed. He handed me my bag of snacks. He had a big smile on his face and said, "If you need anything else, let me know." I thanked him and left. When I got back outside, I saw that the car was gone. At first, I thought that Jeremy had pulled up to the side of the building because I was taking too long. But I looked around the car parking lot and found that the car wasn't there. I couldn't believe it. Jeremy left me in the middle of nowhere. This didn't seem like him at all. How could he do this to me? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I pulled out my phone and called him, and he didn't pick up. It was a really hot day, and sweat oozed down my face. I walked back inside. "Back so soon?" the cashier asked. I explained that my boyfriend had ditched me here. I was so angry that the words barely came out of my mouth. The cashier walked around the counter and gave me a tight hug. "I'm so sorry," he said. "You don't deserve to be treated like that." I'd never met this man before, obviously, but I felt really comfortable in his arms. I could tell that he genuinely felt sorry for me. Eventually, he pulled away and offered me to hang out with him in the back of the store until Jeremy changed his mind and came back. It seemed like a good idea. At the very least, I'd be able to sit for a while and calm down. He led me to the little back room, which had a sofa, a table, and a small TV. The AC was on, so it was nice and cool. As I sat down, the man ran to the window and closed the curtain so the sunlight wouldn't be in my face. Then he sat next to me. "My name is Tom," he said. "Carly," I told him. It was awkward at first, but slowly we started talking. I told him all about my trip so far. I asked him what it was like to live in the middle of the desert. He seemed like a really nice, charming guy. He was also extremely handsome. Honestly, he was better looking than Jeremy. I asked him if he was dating anyone. "Not at the moment," he said, "but it's easy to find people." I flinched a little. That was kind of weird to say. We continued talking, and I noticed that Tom kept glancing towards the curtain-covered window. I wasn't sure, but it seemed like he was hiding something just outside. I stood up, pretending to stretch my legs, and I walked over to the window. "What are you doing?" he snapped at me. That's when I knew he was definitely hiding something. He jumped up to stop me, but I was too fast. I pulled open the window and immediately saw what he was trying to hide. Our car parked behind the building, and Jeremy still inside, slumped against the steering wheel. "What the? You weren't supposed to see that," Tom said. He stepped closer until his face was inches from mine. "What did you do?" "I heard the way he talked to you," Tom explains, "and I couldn't stand it. You deserved better. So while you were in the bathroom, I went outside and took care of him." "You killed him?" "I was trying to help you. You don't need someone like that in your life." I was too shocked to speak. He leaned closer and tried to kiss me. The man was a psychopath. In his twisted brain, he thought that he was being chivalrous, that he was saving me. I pushed him away. Immediately, his face twisted into a furious scowl. "You're just like all the others, you ungrateful idiot." He lunged at me, his large hands grabbing my shoulders and shoving me onto the cold floor. I struggled to twist out of his grip, but he pinned me to the floor. His shoulders struck the edge of the table, and the small TV crashed onto the floor. It narrowly missed my head. "I won't let you go until you admit that I helped you," He screamed in my face. I couldn't push him off me, so I reached my arm towards the shattered TV at my side. Desperately, I grabbed onto a shard of glass. It sliced into my palm, but it didn't stop me. In one quick motion, I jammed the glass upward, piercing him in the side of the neck. His eyes shot open, and his hands loosened their grip. I pulled away from him and jumped to my feet. He was on his knees, trying to pull the glass from his neck. "Don't pull it out," I told him, but he didn't listen. He yanked out the shard, and a splatter of blood burst out of him. In seconds, he collapsed to the ground. He wasn't dead yet, but he was very quickly bleeding out. I shakily pulled out my phone and called 911. By the time they came, Tom was dead. So was Jeremy. After giving my statement to the police, they let me go. I drove all the way back home. I still haven't told anyone what happened. I'm not strong enough. I can't believe that my whole life changed just because I'd gotten into an argument at a gas station.
The clatter of rain against the windows mirrored the storm brewing within me. I stared at the insurance cancellation notice on the table, the bold red letters shouting at me like an accusation. In 2 days, our coverage would lapse, and it wasn't the only bill we were behind on. The root of it all sat in the driveway. Those damn car rims, shining like the silver bullet to our financial stability. My husband Mark had a knack for turning small disagreements into monumental disasters. We'd been scraping by, both working fewer hours than usual, and yet he insisted on those rims. I'd told him no, explained the consequences, but he had his way of justifying things until they seemed like necessities. "You just don't understand," he'd said, almost pleading, the night before he went through with the purchase. "It's not just about the rims, it's about feeling good, having something to show for ourselves." "And what about our bills, Mark? What about our insurance?" I'd retorted, my voice rising with frustration. "We can't afford this." He'd nodded, seemingly agreeing, but his eyes had already glazed over, his mind miles away from our conversation. 2 days later, the rims were on the car, glistening like trophies. Now, I was left with the aftermath. It was late at night, and I was still wide awake, anxiety gnawing at my insides. Mark was snoring softly beside me, oblivious to the turmoil he'd caused. I couldn't just sit by and watch our life crumble. The stress was eating me alive, and I needed a way out, a solution. I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, where the soft hum of the refrigerator provided a semblance of normalcy. My eyes landed on a stack of bills, and an idea began to form. What if there was a way to fix everything, a way to turn our situation around? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The next morning, I confronted Mark with a plan. "I've been thinking," I said over breakfast, my voice carefully controlled. "We need to make some changes. I found a couple of freelance gigs online that could help us catch up on the bills, but you need to sell those rims." He looked at me, his expression hardening. "Come on, Lisa. We talked about this. They're not just rims, they're an investment." "No, Mark," I said firmly. "They're a luxury we can't afford. We're drowning in debt, and if we don't do something, we're going to lose more than just our insurance." He didn't respond, just picked up his coffee and walked out the door. I knew he wouldn't listen, but I had to try. That night, I waited until he was asleep before I took action. I found the contact information of a pawn shop in a rough part of town, one that wouldn't ask too many questions. The next day, while Mark was at work, I drove to the shop with the rims in the trunk. The man behind the counter gave me a suspicious look but offered a fair price. It wasn't enough to cover all our bills, but it was a start. When Mark came home and saw the car without its precious rims, he exploded. "What the hell, Lisa? Where are my rims?" "I sold them," I said quietly. "We needed the money." "You had no right!" he shouted, his face turning red. "Those were mine!" "No, Mark," They were ours, and they were ruining us. I stood my ground, meeting his furious gaze. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I didn't know where he went, but I didn't care. For once, I felt like I was in control. Days passed and Mark barely spoke to me. The tension was palpable, but I focused on the freelance work, slowly chipping away at our debts. One night, while I was working late, I heard a noise outside. I peered through the window and saw Mark talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were standing next to the car, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The next morning, the car was gone. Mark didn't come home that night, and I couldn't reach him on his phone. Panic set in, but I tried to stay calm. I called the police and reported the car stolen, but without much hope. I had a sinking feeling that Mark was involved. A week later, I got a call from the police. They'd found the car abandoned in a bad part of town, stripped of everything valuable. They also found Mark, or what was left of him. The officer's voice was grim as he explained that Mark had been involved in something dangerous, likely trying to get back the money for the rims. He'd crossed the wrong people, and it had cost him his life. The funeral was a blur. I felt numb, unable to process the whirlwind of events. Our friends and family offered condolences, but I could see the judgment in their eyes. They didn't understand the hell we'd been through, the choices that led us here. In the weeks that followed, I found myself alone in our house, haunted by memories. I couldn't escape the guilt, the feeling that I'd somehow caused this. But as I sorted through Mark's things, I discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in the back of his closet was a small black notebook. Inside, I found pages of scribbled notes, detailing Mark's secret life. He'd been involved in illegal activities for months, trying to make quick money. The rims had just been the tip of the iceberg. As I read through the notebook, a disturbing pattern emerged. Mark had been manipulated, coerced into making bad decisions by people who preyed on his weaknesses. He'd been desperate, and they'd taken advantage of that. But among the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope. I found a letter addressed to me, written in Mark's shaky handwriting. In it, he apologized for everything, admitting his mistakes and expressing his love for me. He explained that he'd been trying to make things right, to give us a better life, but he'd gotten in too deep. The letter ended with a plea for forgiveness and a promise that he'd try to leave something behind for me. Attached was a key and an address. It led me to a small storage unit, where I found a box containing cash. Enough to cover our debts and then some. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the sorrow. Mark had made terrible choices, but in the end, he tried to do right by me. I used the money to pay off our bills and started fresh, determined to honor his memory by making better choices. It wasn't easy, but I found a way to move forward. I took on more freelance work, slowly rebuilding my life. The nightmares still came, but with them, a sense of purpose. I'd survived, and I'd make sure that Mark's sacrifice wasn't in vain. In the end, I found peace in the small moments. Morning walks in the park, the warmth of a good book, and the quiet comfort of a home free of debt. Mark's ghost lingered, but it no longer haunted me. Instead, it reminded me of the strength I'd found in the face of adversity, the resilience that had carried me through. And as the days turned into months, I realized that I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And that was the greatest victory of all.
The music was set low. Typical. Just how they always played music so that one could hear the voices of patrons drinking at their tables across the room. I always loved it there since I found the spot on a cold night out 3 weeks ago. The atmosphere was cool, just like the 90s blues that filled the air with its patient crooning. I was on my second drink. The first had been a potent combination of tequila, lemon, and salt. It had hit my stomach and pulled out the anxiety from my core. In a way that was unusual, I felt more at ease with the crowd around me. I was staring at the plant on the table when our eyes hooked on each other. It was the most stunning moment of my life in months. I was sure my heart skipped more than a couple of beats at this muse of a moment. Her red dress risked a slit down the side that showed off her beauty. I downed the second shot before me in a blink, dusted my suit, and approached her with all the pretense of an important figure as I could muster. Our talk was smooth, easy chatter, like minds that had found each other in the strangest of places. She mentioned her name was Jennifer, and I told her my name, David. I was a writer pining for company, and she yearned for companionship. I was hooked indeed. All of my loneliness evaporated with each sentence that billed our conversation. I could not deny myself the ache for her scent. She perceived it in me and said we could go back to her place. What fear could I have? She did not seem dangerous. I had seen women like her in many cities of the world. I awoke each morning with the smell of their body in my breath. There was no debate as to the invitation. "I have Netflix," she said to me on the drive home, as though it were supposed to make me excited. "Visual stimulation," she clarified. "It helps younger writers like me with inspiration." I sighed and contained myself until I was inside of her house. "No dogs? Cats?" I asked, puzzled by how quiet the house was. Almost as though the quiet was artificial, amplified deliberately to conceal some other problem. It was the first sign something was wrong, but I had not thought about it too deeply. "No, just me," she answered, shrugging as she walked around the sitting room, setting up the television set as I sat on the couch. "What do you watch on Netflix?" I didn't know. I don't watch television. So I asked her to put on her favorite show, and I'll enjoy it with her. I added that I hope it's as good as her self-published work, an excerpt of which I had read during our ride back to her house. She laughed at the joke and promised to make sure it's a movie I like. Then she stopped abruptly and stared down a door which had been shut when we had walked in. I followed her line of sight, and the door was open. "That's weird," I blurted, before I could recollect my thoughts on what was happening around me. A sense of what was amiss gnawed at my gut, and I had an urge to leave. But I thought against it because it would be rude to leave my host's house at such a short notice. Jennifer tried to smile, but her face betrayed a mirthless sense of confusion. My heart started to beat faster than it usually would. The adrenaline fed my senses with such a stimulation as I had never felt before. In that moment, knowing something terrifying was about to happen and not knowing how, I broke into a sweat. "Is your house haunted?" I asked quietly, hoping for humor to break down the suffocating tension in the room. "No, it's not," she replied and gulped. I knew she was telling the truth, but the way she stared, it was a blank stare into nothing, into the dark passageway as though there was some force conjuring her attention to it. "Are you possessed?" I was able to rein my thoughts in with some regulation before the words left my mouth. My instinctive reaction was of utter terror, and my feet felt the compulsion to escape. But the writer part of me wanted to see it through, however frightening the night ended. "God, no," she muttered repeatedly, as though it helped the fact that I was almost shitting my pants seated on her couch. "Jennifer!" I barked, and she jumped, startled to even look at me. Her eyes watered up, and she struggled to manage her attention between me and the open passageway. "Leave, David," she said to me. I was hesitant. "What about Netflix?" I said, beside myself with dread but unwilling to show it. I could feel it. She had bled her fear on me, and even the nails of my fingers had gone cold from the infection. It mattered more that I was afraid of what was happening because I did not know what was happening. Jennifer picked her hands up and started to move forward in gingerly steps. Each step was like watching a horror movie play out in front of me with real-life consequences. My belly folded in on itself, and my stomach juices rolled up to the back of my tongue. "Please, don't hurt him. I'm tired of you doing this. How did you find me?" Jennifer cried as she approached the door. Gently as she could, she lay her hands on the door to close it. A hand from inside the dark passageway reached out and pulled her by the hair. I jumped in my seat and scrambled to the floor in sheer fright. The thoughts in my head went wild from the surge. The lashing noise of Jennifer's body whipping against the floor set my entire body on alert. I turned around as a monstrous man, eyes red with rage, slipped out of the darkness. "You can never get rid of me. I'll kill every man that touches you until you want me again," the man cried. "Hey, man, I apologize. I didn't know she was yours." I begged for my life, seeing no sense in trying to escape, as he looked like he would outrun me. He slipped his hands into his pants quietly and retrieved a long, glistening knife. "I'll cut you up," he said, "limb from limb, just like the others." My life flashed before my eyes when he started to approach me. I thought of everything I had done and the life that it had gifted me. Childhood reeled into teenage years and adulthood. It was all painfully fast, and I awaited death with bated breath. My head drumming loudly and my heart almost pumping out of my chest, I had surrendered to my fate. Before I heard the loud gunshot echo through the atmosphere, with a single bullet to the center of his head, I saw the monster of a man collapse to his face in front of me. Jennifer held the gun in her trembling hands and muttered words of how she was tired of her volatile ex who would not let her be, chasing her from city to city and making her life a living hell. She cussed at his body and kicked him. Then she turned to me. "Leave, David," she said. Shaken by the traumatic experience, I left straight for the hospital for some help from the horrifying experience I had just experienced.
My younger sister Ginny and I have birthdays just a few days apart, so we always have to share our birthday parties. Even though I'm 5 years older, every year I was stuck doing whatever Ginny wanted to do. I always felt like such an afterthought, and it drove me crazy. I decided that this year would be different. I was finally turning 18, and I didn't need any more family parties. I pulled my parents aside and told them to just have a party for Ginny. I'd rather go on a camping trip with my friends instead. At first, my parents seemed to understand where I was coming from. Deep down, they knew how much they favored my sister. They were about to give me their permission when Ginny charged into the room and demanded that I stay for her party. She went into a complete meltdown, screaming about how I was ruining her special day. It was obnoxious and obviously exaggerated, but my parents had to placate her. They said Ginny could have her party by herself, but she could also come on the camping trip with me. I couldn't believe it. They thought this was some big compromise, even though it just meant Ginny now had 2 parties instead of 1. I was so angry, but I had to go along with it or they wouldn't give me any presents. I went up to my room and called my boyfriend Trevor to tell him the bad news. He seemed really disappointed, suggesting that we reschedule for the next weekend. I was done changing my plans, so I told him no. That Friday, Ginny and I arrived at the campsite. Trevor was waiting there to greet us, but I didn't see any of our other friends. He sheepishly told us that everyone else canceled after they found out my sister was coming. "Sure they did," Ginny said, refusing to believe that she was so unliked. Instead, she accused him of uninviting them himself. It was a weird thing to say. Trevor, unfortunately, hated when people corrected him, so the conversation very quickly turned into an argument. Eventually, I had to step in. I told Ginny to wait in the tent while Trevor and I went for a walk. She argued for a second, but then she gave in. I said some pretty mean things to make her stay. So we left her there. Trevor and I had been to this area before, so I wasn't really paying attention to where we were going. I just followed Trevor. Eventually, we got to a clearing that I didn't recognize. The trees were especially twisted, and there was a deep crack in the ground, wide enough for someone to fall into. This was not a good place to stop. Trevor must have disagreed because he spread a picnic blanket on the uneven ground and laid out cheese and crackers. I sat across from him as we talked and ate. It felt great to be away from everyone, just the two of us. I was still disappointed that the rest of our friends bailed, but it was honestly better this way. Trevor and I were so comfortable together. Then I noticed something weird. Trevor kept mentioning Ginny and my family. He kept twisting the conversation back to how much I prioritized my family over everyone else. I'd never realized how much that upset him. Trevor's mood just kept getting darker and darker. He was ruining our perfectly good picnic. I'd seen him go off on his little rages before, but they'd never been directed at me. I tried to calm him down to explain that I'd have less family pressure now that I was 18, but he wasn't listening. It was like he wanted to get into an argument. I stood up and started to walk away, but Trevor jumped to his feet and grabbed me. "Let me go!" I screamed, but I knew that we were too far away for Jenny to hear me. Normally, she would have followed us, but after the way I demanded that she stay at the tent, I knew that she'd stay put. "I'll never let you go," he said. "You'll be mine forever." And with that, he shoved me to the side. I hadn't realized how close I was to the wide crack in the ground. My shoulder slammed into the rock edge, and then I toppled about 12 feet into the hole. My entire left side was screaming with pain. The chasm was dark and narrow. I felt like I was in a coffin. There were roots jutting out of the walls, enough for me to climb back up. I grabbed one and pulled, but I didn't have the strength to lift myself up. One of my arms was definitely broken. From the surface, Trevor looked down and smiled. "It looks like you're trapped in there, and I'm the only one who knows." I begged for him to help me get out, but he just shook his head. Now that he had me all to himself, he wouldn't let me go. He casually sat on the edge, his legs dangling just out of reach, and explained what would happen next. He'd return to Ginny and tell her I got lost. Then he'd make sure to send the search parties in the opposite direction. And every day he'd come back to visit me with food that he'd drop into the hole. Just as he was explaining his insane plan, he abruptly stopped talking, gasped for a second, and then toppled forward into the hole. Unlike me, he landed headfirst, passing out on impact. I looked back up and saw Ginny standing at the edge of the hole. She'd pushed him over. "I was following you," she said. "I knew you shouldn't trust him." Then she lowered down the thickest vine she could find and encouraged me to climb up with one hand. Once I was within reach, she grabbed onto my shirt and pulled me the rest of the way. We sat together on the edge of that dark pit. She wrapped me in a tight hug. We started talking about her own birthday party next week. It was going to be horse-themed, an idea that I genuinely hated. She asked me if I was going to come. "Of course," I said. "We're sisters." I was standing at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping around me, cold and unforgiving. Below, the waves crashed against the rocks, each one echoing the turmoil in my heart. How had it come to this? Betrayal, lies, and deceit, all wrapped up in the guise of family loyalty. It all began in 2020, a year already stained with chaos and uncertainty. My mom, a woman whose bitterness seemed to grow with each passing day, started her relentless campaign. She wanted my dad's shares in the family's corporation. The bylaws were clear. Only lineal descendants could own them. But my mom, never one to be deterred by rules, believed she deserved them for enduring the so-called burden of my in-laws. "Would you give me your shares when your dad passes away?" she asked one evening, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Your sister already said yes. Will you?" Her words stung, but I stood my ground. "No, I won't," I replied firmly. The anger in her eyes was palpable, but I didn't care. I wouldn't be bullied into submission. Later, I confided in my dad. He listened quietly, his face a mask of concern. "Don't worry about it," he said finally. "I'll take care of it." A week later, my mom approached me, a triumphant glint in her eye. She handed me a document, an addendum signed by both my dad and my uncle, granting her the shares. "Dad asked me not to show you this," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "But I thought you should know." My heart sank. I hoped it was a forgery, a desperate attempt by my mom to manipulate the situation. But my uncle confirmed it. He had signed it, they both had. The betrayal cut deep, but it wasn't just the shares. It was the realization of how vile my mom truly was. The woman who was supposed to protect and nurture had become a predator, tearing our family apart for her own gain. I withdrew from my mom and sister, going no contact, hoping distance would bring clarity. But the anger festered, a constant gnawing presence. I couldn't escape it. I started digging, looking for any way to reverse the addendum, any legal loophole that could restore the balance. One night, I found myself in the old family cabin, a place that held so many memories. I was sifting through boxes of documents, searching for something, anything, when I stumbled upon an old journal. It belonged to my mom. The entries were filled with venom, detailing her resentment towards my dad, my in-laws, even us kids. But one entry stood out. It was from 2005, the year my sister was born. She wrote about an affair. How she had planned to leave my dad but stayed for the sake of appearances and financial security. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and a dark, unsettling satisfaction. My mom wasn't just a manipulative schemer. She was a liar, living a double life. I had to confront her. I waited until the next family gathering, a somber affair given the tension. I cornered my mom in the kitchen, the journal clutched in my hand. "What's this?" I demanded, shoving the open page in her face. Her eyes widened and narrowed. "Where did you get that?" she hissed. "Does it matter? You lied to all of us. You were going to leave Dad, but you stayed for the money." She laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "And you think you're any better? You're just like him, clinging to those shares, to the power they represent." I was shaking with rage. "You don't deserve them. You never did." She stepped closer, her voice a low whisper. "Maybe not. But I have them now, and there's nothing you can do about it." As she turned to leave, I noticed a familiar glint in her eye, the same one she had when she showed me the addendum. It hit me then, like a bolt of lightning. She had orchestrated this whole thing, not just to get the shares, but to destroy me, to turn me against my dad. I couldn't let her win. I had to find a way to expose her, to show the world who she really was. I spent the next few months gathering evidence, digging into her past, her finances, her connections. The more I found, the darker the picture became. My mom wasn't just a bitter woman. She was involved in illegal activities, using the family's corporation as a front. I went to the authorities, hoping they would take action, but the process was slow, and my mom was always one step ahead. She knew I was coming for her, and she retaliated with a vengeance. She spread rumors, turned family and friends against me, and even tried to frame me for embezzlement. I was spiraling, losing everything I had worked for. One night, I found myself back at the cliff, the waves crashing below, a bottle of whiskey in hand. I felt a strange sense of peace, a resignation to my fate. But then I remembered my dad, my sister, even my in-laws. They deserved better. I couldn't let my mom's poison spread any further. I made one last call to a journalist friend. I handed over all the evidence, every dirty secret I had uncovered. It was my final act of defiance. The story broke, and the fallout was immediate. My mom was arrested, the corporation was investigated, and the shares were frozen. But the damage was done. Our family was shattered, trust destroyed beyond repair. I stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the waves, feeling the weight of my decisions. I had won, but at what cost? The victory was hollow, the future uncertain. In the end, I walked away, leaving the past behind, knowing that some scars never heal, and some betrayals are never forgiven. The night was dark, and the streets were deserted as I pulled up to the traffic light, waiting for the light to change. My mind was occupied with thoughts of the long workday, barely noticing the figure approaching my car window. "Excuse me, sir, spare some change?" The voice was almost a whisper, but it jolted me out of my reverie. I turned to see a disheveled man, his eyes pleading as he extended a weathered hand. Instinctively, I reached for my wallet, ready to offer some assistance, but as I patted around to figure out which pocket my wallet was in, I felt a pang of unease. I was barely able to pay my bills, and I had just checked my bank account to make sure I had enough to buy toilet paper. On top of that, there was something about this situation and the panhandler that didn't sit right with me. "I'm sorry, I don't have any cash on me," I said, my voice faltering slightly. The man's eyes narrowed, his expression darkened. "Come on, man, just a few bucks. I'm desperate here," he pleaded, his tone growing more insistent. Before I could respond, the light changed, and I hastily rolled up my window, eager to escape the uncomfortable encounter. I mouthed sorry to him as I turned left into the Walmart parking lot. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into the back of my head. I pulled into a parking spot and got out of my car. The lights in the parking lot flickered. I was still thinking of that weathered man. I felt bad I couldn't give him anything, but times were tough. I was only at Walmart to get toilet paper, but I also grabbed a $5 bath bomb for my wife. I couldn't afford flowers, but she would love a bath bomb just as much. Before I headed to the checkout, I got a text from my wife. "Can you grab a pizza or lasagna for dinner? It was a long day and I don't want to cook." I responded, "For you, anything. Any particular pizza sound good?" She told me to get whatever I wanted because she only cared about having an easy dinner. I strolled over to the frozen pizza aisle and assessed all my options. Was I in a thick or thin crust mood? What toppings? I took my time deciding before I landed on a boring pepperoni pizza. I headed to the self-checkout, swiped my card, and headed back out to my car. The closer I got to the car, the stronger the smell of cigarettes became. I looked around to see if someone was smoking, but I was the only one in the parking lot. When I reached my car, there was a foul stench. It smelled dirty. Again, I looked around to see where the smell came from, but I was the only one in the parking lot. I threw the toilet paper in the trunk and approached the door. When I opened it, I realized I had forgotten to lock it. My mind was so wrapped up thinking about the panhandler, I forgot to hit the lock button. My heart skipped a beat, but relief washed over me when I remembered that I had nothing of value in my car. So, there was nothing someone would want to steal. I got in my car, and the foul odor increased tenfold. "Jesus Christ," I said out loud. I plugged my nose and held my breath. "I should have gotten car fresheners." I rolled the windows down on my way home, which helped, but I still held my breath at intervals. When I pulled into the garage, all the lights in my home were on. My wife beat me home. I crawled out of my car and got the toilet paper from the back and went inside. My wife was drinking a cup of wine, waiting for me. She greeted me with a smile. "What kind of pizza did you get?" I showed her the pepperoni pizza. "Can't go wrong with pepperoni," she said. "That's what I thought," I responded. "And one more thing." I pulled out the bath bomb and her face lit up. She ran over to me but recoiled. "What is that smell?" she asked. "Did you smoke a cigarette?" "No, but I think someone was smoking one when I left Walmart." I sniffed my shirt. "I don't mean to be mean, but can you change and take a quick shower? You reek. I can get the pizza started." I obliged. As we ate, she told me all about this one troubled coworker she has who never does any work. I love her, but she can ramble. She went on, and my mind wandered back to the panhandler. I'm unsure why the thought wandered into my head, but I wondered how long it would have taken him to walk to the Walmart parking lot. Could he have been the source of the smell? Did he rummage through my car to see if there was anything to steal? Except my car didn't look like anyone had gone through it. I thought of that old urban legend about a villain sneaking into the back of an unsuspecting individual's car. When the person leaves and when they're far enough away, the villain reveals himself and kills the driver. Could the panhandler have snuck into my car to hitch a ride home? I told my wife my thought process, and she thought maybe I should take an anxiety pill. It sounded like my mind was running wild with these thoughts. That story is just an urban legend. Still, I checked my car. I drive an SUV, so he could have sat all the way in the back and I wouldn't have seen him. I went out to my car and the garage was filled with that nasty odor. I plugged my nose and inspected my car. No one was in it. With that, my wife and I went to bed. Later that night, the same stench crawled back up my nose while I slept. When I woke, I felt like I was in a cloud of that smell, which also woke my wife up. "What is that? Did a pipe break?" my wife inquired. I heard something shuffle by her closet. I squinted my eyes to try and make out what was in the dark, and I saw a figure. It was like a night terror where a shadowy silhouette was coming towards you, but you couldn't move or scream. But this shadow remained where it was. Dread filled my body. My wife grabbed my hand. "Honey, do you see that?" She turned on the light. The room illuminated, revealing the panhandler standing by our closet, breathing heavily, his face twisted in a sinister grin. "Thought you could ignore me, huh?" he sneered, advancing towards us with a menacing intent. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. Under the bed, I kept a steel baseball bat just in case something like this happens. I jumped out of bed and grabbed it. With a cry of fear and desperation, I swung the bat with all my might. The sound of the metal hitting the panhandler's head echoed through the room. My wife screamed. Like a tree, he fell to the floor. I called the authorities so they would take him away. I wasn't charged for anything on account of self-defense.